When Margaret Rose was sold by her own brother for being too fat at a Kansas Territory auction in 1867, she thought her life had reached its lowest point. But what happens when the mysterious cowboy who bought her freedom reveals he never intended to own her at all? The auction block felt like fire under Margaret Rose's feet, as men with dirty hands pointed at her like she was a prize cow. It was July 1867 in Abilene, Kansas, and the hot sun made her heavy dress stick to her skin. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go in this dusty frontier town where cattle and people got sold the same way. "Look at the size of her," shouted a man with tobacco stains on his teeth. "She could plow a field all by herself." Margaret's face burned with shame as laughter rolled through the crowd like thunder. Just 3 weeks ago, she had been safe in Boston, helping her brother Harold with his bookkeeping business. Then everything changed when she found that terrible letter he wrote to his business partner out west. "Margaret has become too much trouble," the letter had said. "At her size, no man here will marry her. Send her to Kansas where they need strong women for work. I'll split the money with you." Her own brother was selling her like a piece of furniture he didn't want anymore. Now she stood on wooden steps outside the courthouse, watching men argue about how much she was worth. Her hands shook as she held the only thing she had left from home, a small leather book filled with pressed flowers her mother had given her before she died. $50, called out a rancher with a big belly and mean eyes. "She can cook and clean, and she's too heavy to run away." More laughter. Margaret bit her lip to keep from crying. She had always been bigger than other girls, and people back in Boston whispered about her behind their hands. But this was different. This was being sold like a horse or a bag of flour. "60!" shouted another man. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's voice singing lullabies. But all she could hear was the sound of coins jingling and men talking about her like she wasn't even there. Then a different voice cut through the noise, quiet but strong like steel. $75. Margaret opened her eyes and saw a cowboy standing at the back of the crowd. He was tall and lean, with dusty clothes and a hat that shadowed his face. But his eyes were bright blue and kind, not cruel like the others. "Cash money," the cowboy added, pulling bills from his pocket. The crowd went quiet. $75 was more than most people made in 3 months. Harold's partner, Mr. Pike, rubbed his hands together like he was washing them. "Sold to the gentleman in the back." Margaret felt her knees go weak. She had been bought by a stranger who looked like he belonged in this wild place where anything could happen. As the cowboy walked toward her, she wondered if this was better or worse than being sold to the mean-eyed rancher. "Name's Jackson Reed," he said softly, tipping his hat. "Don't worry, miss. Things ain't what they seem." But Margaret was too scared to feel hopeful. She had learned that when people said not to worry, that's exactly when you should worry the most. Jackson helped her down from the steps with gentle hands. His touch was different from the rough grabbing she expected. As they walked toward his wagon, she heard people talking behind them. "That Reed fellow's got more money than sense," someone said. "Wonder what he wants with a girl that size," said another. Margaret's cheeks burned again. Even when someone was kind to her, people still had cruel things to say. She climbed into the wagon and sat as far from Jackson as she could, clutching her flower book like it might protect her. The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled out of town. Margaret watched the buildings get smaller behind them, wondering if she would ever see another city again. The prairie stretched out forever, covered in golden grass that moved like ocean waves in the wind. "Where are we going?" she finally asked. Jackson didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the dusty road. "My ranch. About an hour's ride. What do you want me to do there?" This time he did look at her, and his blue eyes were sad. "First thing, I want you to remember that you're a person, not a thing that can be bought and sold." Margaret stared at him. Nobody had ever said anything like that to her before, not even her brother, who was supposed to love her no matter what. As they rode deeper into the endless grassland, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in months, a tiny spark of hope flickering in her chest, like a candle flame in the wind. Jackson's ranch sat in a valley where purple and yellow wildflowers grew between the rocks like nature's own garden. Margaret had expected a rough cabin with dirt floors and broken windows, but instead she saw a real house with glass windows that caught the afternoon light like jewels. "This is where you live?" she asked, surprised. Jackson nodded as he helped her down from the wagon. Built it myself over the past 3 years. Wanted something that felt like home, not just a place to sleep. The inside was even more surprising. Clean wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and a kitchen that smelled like fresh bread and coffee. Real books sat on shelves near the window, and wildflowers in a glass jar made the room feel warm and welcoming. Margaret stood in the doorway, afraid to touch anything. Everything was so nice, and she had learned to be careful around nice things. They usually belonged to people who didn't want her around. "Sit down," Jackson said, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. "I'll make some coffee, and we can talk." "Talk about what?" Margaret asked, still standing. "About why you look like a rabbit who's about to run from a wolf." Margaret's face got hot. "I don't know what you mean." Jackson poured water into a coffee pot and set it on the stove. "I mean, you're scared of everything. Scared to sit down, scared to talk, scared to even look at me. Someone hurt you real bad, didn't they?" Margaret's hands tightened on her flower book. "My brother didn't hurt me. He just knew I was too much trouble." "Your brother sold you like a piece of cattle," Jackson said, his voice getting hard. "That's hurting you." But he was right. The words burst out of Margaret like water from a broken dam. "I am too big, too difficult, too much for anyone to want. At least this way I can work for my keep instead of being useless." Jackson turned from the stove and looked at her with those kind blue eyes. "Who told you that you were useless?" "Everyone," Margaret whispered. "The girls at church back home, the men who came to call on other ladies, even the store clerks who looked at me like I was taking up too much space." "And you believed them?" Margaret nodded, feeling tears start to build behind her eyes. "Wouldn't you?" Jackson was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his shirt and pulled out a small silver locket on a chain. He opened it and showed her a picture of a young woman with dark hair and a sweet smile. "This is my wife, Elena," he said softly. "She died 2 years ago from a fever. People in town used to say she was too good for a rough cowboy like me. Said she should have married the banker's son or the preacher instead." Margaret looked at the picture. The woman was beautiful, with delicate features and kind eyes. "She looks lovely." She was. But you know what she told me when people said those things? Jackson closed the locket carefully. "She said that people who spend their time judging others have forgotten how to see the good in anything. She said the only opinion that mattered was hers and mine." The coffee pot started to whistle, and Jackson poured 2 cups. He set one in front of Margaret and sat down across from her. "I didn't buy you to be my slave," he said. "I bought you to give you a chance to remember who you are when nobody's telling you who you should be." Margaret stared at him. "I don't understand." "I saw the way you looked at those men at the auction, like you had given up on everything good in the world. I've seen that look before, in the mirror, after Elena died. Someone needs to remind you that you're worth more than what cruel people say about you." Margaret took a sip of coffee and felt warmth spread through her chest. "Why would you care about a stranger?" Jackson smiled, and it changed his whole face. "Because Elena would have. She always said that kindness was like seeds. Plant enough of it, and eventually beautiful things grow." Outside, the wind rustled through the prairie grass, and Margaret heard birds singing in the distance. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe deeply. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you rest, eat good food, and remember that you're safe here. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next." Margaret nodded, feeling that tiny spark of hope grow a little brighter. Maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she could be herself without apologizing for taking up space. But as the sun set over the Kansas prairie, neither of them knew that trouble was already riding toward them, carrying the face of her past and the threat of her future. The scream that woke Margaret came from the barn, sharp and terrible in the pre-dawn darkness. She sat up in her bed, heart hammering, as Jackson's boots thundered across the wooden floor of the main house. Through her window, she saw an orange glow that shouldn't be there. Fire, licking at the edges of the barn like a hungry beast. "Stay inside!" Jackson shouted as he ran past, but Margaret was already pulling on her dress. The horses were trapped in there, and she couldn't just hide while they burned. She rushed outside into air thick with smoke and found Jackson trying to open the barn doors, but they were stuck tight. The fire roared louder now, and she could hear the horses screaming in terror. Without thinking, Margaret grabbed a heavy rock and smashed it against the metal latch that held the doors closed. "What are you doing?" Jackson yelled over the noise. "I told you to stay back." "The horses will die," Margaret shouted back, throwing her whole weight against the door. It creaked open just enough for Jackson to squeeze through. Smoke poured out like a black river, and she heard him coughing inside. One by one, Jackson led the panicked horses out into the yard. Their eyes were wide with fear, and they pranced and snorted, smelling the danger. Margaret counted them: Sunset, the golden mare; Thunder, the big black stallion; and Rosie, the gentle brown horse who let Margaret brush her mane. "That's all of them," Jackson said, his face streaked with soot. Together, they watched the barn burn, the flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like angry fingers. "How did it start?" Margaret asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Jackson picked up something from the ground, a piece of rope that had been soaked in coal oil. "Someone set this fire on purpose. Someone who wanted to hurt us." The next morning brought visitors that made Margaret's blood run cold. 3 men rode up the valley, their horses kicking up dust clouds in the early light. The leader was Mr. Pike, the weasel-faced man who had helped sell her. Behind him rode 2 rough-looking cowboys with guns on their hips and mean expressions on their faces. "Morning, Reed," Pike called out, staying in his saddle like he owned the place. "Heard you had some trouble last night." Jackson stepped onto the porch, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Funny how you heard about it so fast, Pike. Fire only went out a few hours ago." Pike smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Word travels fast in these parts. "I'm here on business, anyway. Got a telegram from Boston yesterday. Seems Miss Fletcher's brother wants her back." Margaret felt her stomach drop to her toes. She had been so happy these past few weeks, helping Jackson with his bookkeeping and learning to ride Rosie. She had started to feel like maybe she belonged somewhere. Now her old life was reaching out to drag her back like a giant hand. "She's not going anywhere," Jackson said, his voice quiet but dangerous. "Oh, but she is," Pike said, pulling out a folded paper. Here's a legal document. Harold Fletcher is her legal guardian, and he's decided she needs to come home. Says this frontier life ain't proper for a lady." Margaret wanted to run, but where could she go? The prairie stretched for miles in every direction, and she didn't know how to survive out there alone. Pike's men were watching her like cats watching a mouse, ready to pounce if she tried to escape. "What's this really about, Pike?" Jackson asked. "You didn't ride all the way out here just to do Harold Fletcher a favor." Pike's smile got wider and nastier. "Smart man. See, I've been thinking about that $75 you paid for her. That's a lot of money for a woman who's just going to leave anyway. Seems like you got cheated. So I'm willing to make you a deal. You let me take her back to town, and I'll give you $50. That way you don't lose everything." Margaret saw what was really happening. Pike wanted to sell her again, probably to someone who would pay even more. She was just a way for him to make money. Over and over. "I said she's not going anywhere," Jackson repeated. One of Pike's men put his hand on his gun. "Maybe you didn't hear right, cowboy. Mr. Pike's being generous. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The morning air felt thick with danger. Margaret realized that Jackson was outnumbered, and if there was a fight, someone might get hurt. Maybe Jackson might even get killed, and it would be her fault. "I'll go," she said quietly. "Margaret, no," Jackson said without taking his eyes off Pike. "I don't want anyone to get hurt because of me," she said, stepping toward Pike's horse. "I've caused enough trouble." But as she moved, Jackson stepped in front of her. "You're not causing trouble. You're standing up for yourself. There's a difference." Pike laughed. How sweet. The cowboy's got feelings for his purchase. "Tell you what, Reed, I'll make it $60, and you can find yourself a woman who won't cause so many problems." That's when Margaret felt something she had never felt before. Pure, burning anger. Not at herself, but at the men who thought they could buy and sell her like a piece of property. "I'm not for sale," she said, her voice stronger than she had ever heard it. "Not to you, not to anyone." Pike's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that, Missy. Boys, let's collect our property and go." The 2 cowboys started to get down from their horses, but Jackson's gun was in his hand faster than lightning. "First man who touches her gets buried in that field yonder." Margaret held her breath. Everything balanced on the edge of a knife, and she knew that whatever happened next would change everything forever. The sound of galloping horses made Margaret drop the plate she was washing, sending pieces of china scattering across the kitchen floor like broken promises. Through the window she saw a cloud of dust approaching fast, too fast to be friendly visitors. Jackson grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace, his face grim. "Margaret, get to the root cellar," he ordered. "Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." But Margaret had seen the rider's face through the dust, and her heart sank like a stone in deep water. "It's Harold," she whispered. "My brother's come for me." Harold Fletcher looked exactly like the stern, disapproving man Margaret remembered from Boston, except now his fine clothes were rumpled from hard travel. Behind him rode Mr. Pike and 4 hired guns, their faces hard as winter ground. Harold's eyes swept over the ranch with obvious disgust. "Margaret Rose Fletcher," he called out, his voice carrying the same tone he'd used to scold her as a child. "Come out here this instant." Jackson stepped onto the porch, his rifle held ready. "State your business, mister." "My business is with my sister," Harold said, climbing down from his horse. "I'm here to collect her and take her back where she belongs." Margaret's hands shook as she moved to the doorway. Harold looked older than she remembered, his face lined with anger and something else. Fear? But fear of what? "Hello, Harold," she said quietly. "Look at you," Harold said, his voice full of disgust. "Living in sin with some cowboy, working like a common servant. Mother would be ashamed. Mother would be proud that I'm finally standing up for myself." Margaret shot back, surprising herself with her boldness. Harold's face turned red. "You're coming with me, Margaret. I won't have you embarrassing our family name any longer." "She's not going anywhere," Jackson said, stepping beside Margaret. "This is her home now." "Her home?" Harold laughed bitterly. "This dusty shack in the middle of nowhere? She has a real home waiting for her in Boston, with a real job as a governess for a respectable family." Margaret felt her old fears creeping back. Part of her wanted to believe Harold, wanted to think that maybe there really was a place for her in the world she had known. But then she remembered the way people in Boston had looked at her, the whispered comments about her size, the way Harold himself had written that terrible letter. What respectable family, she asked. What family would want someone you described as too fat for any decent man to marry? Harold's face went pale. "You read my letter?" "Every word," Margaret said, her voice getting stronger. "Every cruel, heartless word about how I was too much trouble, how you needed to get rid of me like unwanted furniture." "I was trying to help you," Harold exploded. "Do you think it was easy for me, having a sister who embarrassed me every time we went out in public? Do you know what people said about the Fletcher family because of you?" The words hit Margaret like physical blows, but this time she didn't crumble. Instead, she stood straighter. "I know what they said, but I also know that their words don't define who I am." Pike stepped forward, his hand on his gun. "Enough talking. We're taking her back, and that's final." "Try it," Jackson said, raising his rifle. "I'll put you in the ground before you lay a finger on her." "You can't fight all of us," one of Pike's men said, drawing his pistol. Margaret's heart pounded as she realized they were about to have a gunfight right here in the yard. Someone was going to get killed, and it would be her fault. She had to do something. "Wait," she called out. "I'll come with you." "Margaret, no," Jackson said urgently. "I won't have your blood on my hands," she said, touching his arm gently. "I couldn't live with myself if you got hurt because of me." Harold looked triumphant. "Finally, some sense. Get your things, Margaret. We're leaving within the hour." But as Margaret turned toward the house, she saw something that made her freeze. In the distance, riding hard toward the ranch, was a group of riders she recognized. Sheriff Davis and his deputies. Someone had seen the hired guns and gone for help. "Looks like we've got company," Jackson said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Pike cursed under his breath. "Boss, we need to go. Now." But Harold was too angry to think clearly. "I'm not leaving without my sister." "Then you'll be leaving in shackles," Sheriff Davis called out as he rode up. "Harold Fletcher, you're under arrest for kidnapping and conspiracy to commit arson." Harold's face went white. "Kidnapping? I'm her brother." "Being someone's brother doesn't give you the right to have their property burned down or to threaten them with armed men," the sheriff said, dismounting from his horse. "We found the man who set that fire, and he sang like a canary about who paid him to do it." Margaret stared at Harold in shock. "You burned down Jackson's barn." "I had to make him want to get rid of you," Harold said desperately. "I had to make him see that you were nothing but trouble." The truth hit Margaret like a thunderbolt. Harold hadn't come to save her. He had come to finish destroying the only happiness she had ever known. The brother she had tried so hard to please, who she had believed was just trying to help her, had been willing to hurt innocent people to get what he wanted. "You're not my brother," she said, her voice steady and cold. "Brothers don't try to destroy their sisters' lives." As the sheriff put Harold in handcuffs, Margaret realized that she was finally, truly free. Free from the brother who had never loved her. Free from the cruel voices that had told her she wasn't good enough. And free to choose her own path. She turned to Jackson, who was watching her with proud, admiring eyes. "I'm staying," she said. "This is my home now." And for the first time in her life, Margaret Rose Fletcher knew exactly where she belonged. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning when Margaret was teaching Jackson how to make proper biscuits, their laughter filling the kitchen like music. But the yellow paper in the messenger boy's hand carried news that would shatter their peaceful world like glass hitting stone. "It's from the territorial judge," Jackson said, his face growing pale as he read. "Harold's lawyer in Boston is claiming I kidnapped you. Says I used illegal means to keep you here against your family's wishes." Margaret's hands went still in the bread dough. "What does that mean?" "It means they're sending a federal marshal to investigate. If he believes their story, I could go to prison for 20 years. The kitchen suddenly felt cold despite the warm stove. Margaret had finally found happiness, finally found someone who saw her worth, and now her past was reaching out to destroy it all. But this time, she wasn't going to run or hide. "Then we'll tell the marshal the truth," she said firmly. Jackson shook his head. "It's not that simple. Your brother has witnesses in Boston who will say, 'I forced you to stay.' He's got lawyers and money and connections. All I've got is my word." "You've got more than that," Margaret said, wiping flour from her hands. "You've got me." 3 days later, U.S. Marshal Robert Stone rode into their valley like a storm cloud. He was a big man with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as he examined the rebuilt barn, talked to neighbors, and wrote notes in a small black book. When he finally knocked on their door, Margaret's heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst. Jackson answered, his face calm but his hands tense. "Mr. Reed, Miss Fletcher," the marshal said, tipping his hat. "I need to ask you both some questions about the events that brought you together." They sat around the kitchen table like they were having tea, but Margaret could feel the danger in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Marshal Stone asked question after question about the auction, about her life in Boston, about her relationship with Jackson. "Miss Fletcher," the marshal said finally, "your brother claims you were forced to stay here against your will. He says this man threatened you and made you afraid to leave." Margaret looked directly into the marshal's gray eyes. "My brother sold me like a piece of cattle. Jackson bought me to set me free, not to own me. Every day I've stayed here has been my choice. But you have to admit," the marshal continued, "it looks suspicious. A young woman from a good family, living alone with a cowboy in the middle of nowhere. People back east are saying you've been compromised." Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but not with shame this time, with anger. "People back east said a lot of things about me. They said I was too fat, too awkward, too much trouble for any decent man to want. Should I have believed them too?" The marshal studied her for a long moment. "Your brother has offered to take you back to Boston. No questions asked. He's even willing to drop the charges against Mr. Reed if you'll come willingly. And if I refuse, then I'll have to decide whether Mr. Reed committed a crime by keeping you here." That evening, Margaret couldn't sleep. She walked out to the porch and found Jackson sitting on the steps, staring up at the stars. The night air was cool and sweet with the smell of prairie grass. "You should go with your brother," Jackson said quietly. Margaret sat down beside him. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter. I won't see you hurt because of me." "You're not hurting me," Margaret said. "You're the first person who ever made me feel like I was worth something." Jackson turned to look at her, and in the moonlight she could see the pain in his eyes. "I've been thinking about Elena a lot lately, about what she would want me to do." "What would she want?" "She'd want me to fight for you, but she'd also want me to keep you safe, even if it meant letting you go." Margaret reached over and took his hand. "Elena sounds like she was a wonderful woman, but she's not here to make this choice. I am." The next morning brought a surprise that changed everything. A wagon rolled into the valley carrying a woman Margaret had never seen before. Elderly, well-dressed, with kind eyes and silver hair. Behind her came 3 more wagons filled with families. "Marshal Stone!" the woman called out, climbing down from her wagon with surprising energy. "I'm Mrs. Catherine Morris from Topeka. I received your telegram about this investigation." The marshal looked confused. "Ma'am, I didn't send any telegram to Topeka." "I did," said a voice from the second wagon. Margaret gasped as she recognized Sheriff Davis. "I thought you might want to hear from some other folks about Mr. Reed's character." Mrs. Morris walked up to Margaret and took her hands. "My dear, I've known Jackson Reed for 5 years. He helped my late husband build our farm when we first came to Kansas. If Jackson says he bought you to set you free, then that's exactly what he did." One by one, the families from the wagons came forward. They told stories of Jackson helping them through hard times, of his honesty and kindness, of the way he had mourned his wife and kept her memory alive by helping others. "This man never forced anyone to do anything," said a farmer named Tom Miller. "When my barn burned down 2 winters ago, Jackson spent a week helping me rebuild it. Wouldn't take a penny for his work." An older woman named Mrs. Patterson nodded. "And when my daughter was sick with fever, Jackson rode all the way to Dodge City to fetch the doctor. That little girl is alive today because of him." Margaret watched the marshal's face as he listened to story after story. These people had come all this way just to speak up for Jackson, to tell the truth about who he really was. "Marshal," Mrs. Morris said finally, "I've lived on this frontier for 20 years. I've seen men who take advantage of women, and I've seen men who protect them. Jackson Reed is a protector, not a predator." Margaret felt tears start to roll down her cheeks, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of joy. She wasn't alone anymore. She had found not just Jackson, but a whole community of people who understood what it meant to look out for each other. Marshal Stone closed his black book and stood up. "Miss Fletcher, I have one final question for you. If you could go anywhere in the world right now, be anyone you wanted to be, what would you choose?" Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her. Jackson with his kind blue eyes, Mrs. Morris with her gentle smile, all these people who had come to stand up for what was right. "I'd choose to be exactly who I am, exactly where I am," she said clearly. "I'd choose to be Margaret Rose Fletcher, and I'd choose to be home." The morning sun painted the Kansas sky in shades of gold and pink as Margaret stood in her wedding dress, her hands trembling with happiness instead of fear for the first time in her life. She had sewn the dress herself from cream-colored silk that Jackson had ordered special from Kansas City, and it fit her perfectly. No apologies, no hiding, just beautiful fabric that celebrated who she was. "You look like an angel," whispered Mrs. Morris, adjusting the wildflower crown they had made together. "Jackson is the luckiest man in the territory." Through the window of the church, Margaret could see the whole town gathering for the wedding. People had come from farms and ranches for miles around, bringing covered dishes and musical instruments for the celebration. Sheriff Davis was there with his fiddle, and even Marshal Stone had stayed to see them married. But the person Margaret was happiest to see was standing near the front of the church, a young woman about her own age with dark hair and a baby in her arms. This was Susan Miller, Tom's daughter, who had become Margaret's first real friend. Susan had taught her how to garden in the tough prairie soil and how to preserve vegetables for winter. More importantly, Susan had taught her what it felt like to be accepted exactly as she was. "Are you ready?" asked Reverend Walsh, a kind man who had ridden circuit between frontier towns for 30 years. Margaret nodded, her heart full of joy. Through the church doors, she could see Jackson waiting at the altar in his best suit. The silver locket with Elena's picture still around his neck. Margaret had asked him to keep wearing it, because she understood now that love didn't work like pie. Sharing it with Elena's memory didn't mean there was less for her. As she walked down the aisle, Margaret remembered that terrible day at the auction block just 6 months ago. She had felt so worthless then, so sure that nobody could ever love her. Now she was surrounded by friends who had chosen to be part of her new life, marrying a man who saw her beauty when she couldn't see it herself. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Walsh began, "we are gathered here today to witness the marriage of Jackson Reed and Margaret Rose Fletcher, 2 souls who have found in each other the courage to love and be loved. Jackson's hands were warm and steady as he took hers. His eyes were bright with tears of happiness, and when he spoke his vows, his voice carried clearly through the little church. "Margaret, you came into my life when I thought my heart was too broken to love again. You taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means opening your heart wide enough to hold both sorrow and joy. I promise to love you not in spite of who you are, but because of who you are. I promise to stand with you against anyone who tries to make you feel small, and to remind you every day that you are exactly enough." Margaret's voice shook with emotion as she spoke her own vows. "Jackson, you saved me from people who wanted to buy and sell me. But more than that, you saved me from believing I wasn't worth saving. You showed me that true love isn't about changing someone to fit what the world expects. It's about creating a safe place where they can be themselves. I promise to love you with all my heart, to honor Elena's memory alongside our future, and to never forget that the best things in life are worth fighting for." As they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that Jackson had crafted himself at the blacksmith's forge, Margaret felt something shift inside her. All her life, she had defined herself by what she wasn't. Not thin enough, not pretty enough, not worthy enough. But standing here in this church, surrounded by love and acceptance, she finally understood who she really was. She was Margaret Rose Reed, a woman who had survived being sold like property and found the strength to choose her own destiny. She was a woman who could do bookkeeping that helped keep a ranch profitable, who could calm frightened horses during a storm, who could make friends and keep them. She was a woman worthy of love, not because she had changed to deserve it, but because she had always been deserving. The wedding party spilled out of the church into the bright afternoon sunshine, where tables loaded with food waited under the cottonwood trees. Mrs. Patterson's famous fried chicken sat next to Susan Miller's cornbread, and someone had brought a fiddle and a guitar for dancing. As Margaret and Jackson shared their first dance as husband and wife, she saw Marshall Stone preparing to leave. He tipped his hat to her with respect. "Mrs. Reed," he said formally, "I'll be filing my report when I get back to Kansas City. It will state that I found no evidence of any crime, and that Miss Margaret Fletcher made her choice to stay here as a free woman with full knowledge of her options." "Thank you," Margaret said, meaning it with all her heart. "No, ma'am," the marshal replied. "Thank you. In 30 years of law enforcement, I've seen a lot of people who gave up on themselves. It's rare and beautiful to see someone who found the courage to fight for their own worth." As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Margaret and Jackson sat on their porch listening to the sounds of their friends cleaning up from the celebration. The evening air was sweet with the smell of prairie roses, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song. "No regrets?" Jackson asked, taking her hand. Margaret smiled, thinking of all the things that had led her to this moment. Harold's cruelty, the auction block, the fire, the fear, and finally the choice to believe in her own worth. "Only one," she said. "I regret that it took me so long to realize that the only person who gets to decide my value is me." Jackson squeezed her hand. "And what do you think you're worth?" Margaret looked out over the valley that was now her home, at the rebuilt barn where their horses grazed peacefully, at the garden where wildflowers grew alongside vegetables, at the life they had built together, with kindness and hard work and stubborn hope. "Everything," she said simply. "I'm worth everything." And as the first stars appeared in the vast Kansas sky, Margaret Rose Reed knew with absolute certainty that she was home, not just in this place, but in her own skin, in her own life, in the truth of who she had always been beneath what the world tried to tell her she should be. In the distance, the prairie wind whispered through the grass like a blessing, carrying her story across the endless plains where other women might hear it and remember that they too were worth fighting for, worth choosing, worth loving exactly as they were.